Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GCSP for this launch of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor 2021. It's nice to see some people joining us in person, but I know there are many more out there joining us online. My name is Mark Finot. I'm the head of arms proliferation here at the GCSP. I'm pleased to welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GCSP for this launch of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor 2021. It's nice to see some people joining us in person, but I know there are many more out there joining us online. My name is Mark Finot. I'm the head of highlights activities that may hamper such progress and analyzes the key challenges to nuclear disarmament. This is the fourth annual edition of this monitor. And of course, it uses the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as the primary yardstick against which progress is measured towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, but also tracks the status of all states in relation to all the other relevant international, multilateral, bilateral treaties and regimes dealing with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So it's really a reference document, and we are happy to host this launch here at GCSP because this event could not be more timely in a context of international context marked by, among others, the resurgence of the threat of use of nuclear weapons, but also important upcoming events such as the first meeting of states parties of the Tpnw and the 10th review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So we are happy to welcome many experts, outstanding speakers. First, Grete Østern from the Norwegian People's Aid, who is the editor of the monitor. And we also thank Norwegian People's Aid for being a partner to this event. Stuart Casey Meslin, who's honorary professor at the University of Pretoria, but also a GCSP fellow. Bonnie Doherty, who's associate director lecturer at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. Matt Corder, who is a senior research associate and project manager at the Nuclear Information Project of the Federation of American Scientists. And last but not least, Jamie Walsh, Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations here in Geneva. So without further ado, I'll be pleased to hand over the floor to the speakers. We're going to introduce the monitor. So great, are you starting?
Do you want me to start again? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting us here today. I then want to again thank Stuart, who's with me here today, and Bonnie and Matt, who are online, and the many other external experts that have supported the work on this edition. As you can see, it's a comprehensive report, and as Mark said, well, you don't have to read it all. It's intended as a reference work. It has state profiles for all of the 197 states that can become party to the treaties that are deposited with the UN Secretary General. You can take the first slide, Stuart. And it also has separate sections for each of the prohibitions and each of the positive obligations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Tpnw, as we'll be referring to it several times, I'm sure, here today. We use the Tpnw as the primary yardstick when we measure progress towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. But as Mark already mentioned, we also track the status of all of those 197 states in relation to the other relevant multilateral treaties dealing with weapons of mass destruction, including the NPT, the CTBT, the Biological Weapons Convention, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. And then we also assess, with the help of Stuart and other legal experts, the extent to which the 197 states, regardless of whether they have consented to be bound by the treaty, act in accordance with them or not. We categorize the states parties and the signatories as either compliant or not non-compliant, or not compliant with the Tpnw with the specific prohibitions. And the states not party are categorized as either compatible or not compatible. And this is meant as the guidance for states that are already states parties, or that are considering to do so, or that might consider to do so in the future, so that they can see how they need to adapt their policies and practices, or whether they need to do any changes at all in order to be states parties to the treaty. Next slide, please, Stuart. We have, with the help of Nick Ritchie from the University of York, looked at the context of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2021. A dominant narrative of 2021 was increased competition between major powers. And that competition then being centered on new weapon systems and with regional hotspots and with clear risks of escalation to nuclear war. And then we've seen this year that the war in Ukraine and Putin's nuclear threats are yet another stark reminder of the profound dangers of living in a world where some states insist their security must rest on capacity for massive and indiscriminate nuclear violence. So it is clear that we have ended up trusting to luck rather than the supposed stabilizing effects of nuclear deterrence. But there was also increasing engagement with the Tpnw, which by now we can see has been mobilized as a vehicle for collective resistance to the structures of power that perpetuate the existence of nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. There are 156 states, or 4/5 of the world's total, that maintain defense postures that are based exclusively on non-nuclear means. But then there is a substantial minority of 41 states that continued in 2021 to center their defense posture on the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons. And that is, of course, the 9 nuclear armed states and the 32 so-called umbrella states. The addition of the Tpnw to the treaty architecture related to nuclear weapons has highlighted and laid bare the significant role that umbrella states play in perpetuating the idea that nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence are legitimate and necessary. They base their security on one or more allies' continued retention of nuclear weapons, and therefore act as enablers of nuclear armament and obstacles to nuclear disarmament. And this is, by looking at this through the lens of the Tpnw, it is brought more clearly to the front. Because the umbrella states do bear a considerable degree of responsibility for the nuclear risks. Next slide, please. The TPNW, as you know, entered into force under international law on the 22nd of January last year. In the course of the year, there were 7 more states that ratified the treaty: Cambodia, Chile, Comoros, Guinea-Bissau, Peru, the Philippines, and the Seychelles, and then an 8th state, Mongolia, that acceded. But there were no new signatures secured during the course of the year. As you can see from this slide, there are, as of today, this is updated as of today, the new treaty has a total of 60 states parties, and then there are a further 29 states that are signatories, but that haven't ratified yet. And in addition, we identify 49 states as other supporters based on how they vote in the UN on the TPNW resolution. So putting those together, this means that a total of 138 states, or exactly 70%, are effectively supportive of the TPNW. And then there are a total of 17 states, a very mixed group of states that are undecided on the TPNW, and 42 states that are opposed to the treaty. These are, of course, again, then the 9 nuclear armed states, all of the 30 states with arrangements of extended nuclear deterrence with the United States. And then there are also 3 states with nuclear weapon-free security policies: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Micronesia, and Monaco. Next slide, please. Breaking down all states' positions on the TPNW by region, we see that support for the treaty is high in all regions of the world apart from Europe. Europe is where the opposition is centered. A total of 31 of the 47 states in Europe, or 66%, were opposed to the TPNW in 2021. But as we write about in the report, there has been a political debate about the merits of the treaty ongoing in several of the opposed states in Europe in 2021, which continues. Next slide, please. The TPNW's speed of ratification and accession was for a long time the same on average as for the other treaties on weapons of mass destruction. So the red line here is the TPNW. But during the course of 2021, the second year of the pandemic, however, the TPNW's rate of adherence has fallen behind that of all of the other treaties. Next slide, please. We also have the, in terms of the signatures to the TPNW, we know that the number is still at 86. And as this graph shows, the level of signatures to the TPNW is low compared to those of all of the other treaties on weapons of mass destruction. But if you look at this, you see that most of the variation occurs only in the first few months after each of the treaties have opened for signature. And after that, all 5 treaties, including the TPNW, follow a similar pattern. Also note here that the TPNW signature curve is the second lowest of the treaties. So the patterns of signature and ratifications for the NPT serve as a timely reminder, I think, that it took several years also for that treaty to accrue the authority that it has today, and that we need to have patience with this. Next slide, please. All the 59 states parties and 30 signatories to the TPNW were compliant with all of the prohibitions of the TPNW in 2021. And then of the states not yet party to the treaty, the conduct of 64 states was fully compatible with all of the prohibitions. This means that they can adhere to the TPNW without making any changes to their existing policies and practices. And then there is a minority consisting of 42 states not party that in 2021 continued to engage in conduct that was not compatible with one or more of the prohibitions. They can sign and ratify the TPNW, but will have to make varying degrees of changes to their policies and practices in order to meet the demands of the treaty. And again, this is first and foremost the 9 nuclear armed states and the 32 so-called umbrella states, And then the yellow sector there is in addition Iran and Saudi Arabia that were again recorded as states of concern. Next slide, please. Breaking down by region again, we see that Europe is the region with the most states whose conduct conflicts with the TPNW. A total of 30 of the 47 states in Europe maintain policies and practices that are not compatible with one or more of the prohibitions in Article 1 of the TPNW. In Africa, all states were found to be fully compliant or compatible, and in the other regions, compliance and compatibility with the TPNW is also generally high. Next slide. If we disaggregate compliance and compatibility for each of the prohibitions, we get this picture. Most importantly, as you can see, the conduct of the 9 nuclear armed states was not compatible with either the prohibition on developing, producing, manufacturing, or acquiring nuclear weapons, or the prohibition on possessing or stockpiling them. But it is the prohibition in Article 11E on assisting, encouraging, or inducing prohibited acts that stands out as the one where the greatest number of states have policies and practices that are not compatible. We found that a total of 36 states, mostly European, assisted, encouraged, or induced acts in 2021 that are prohibited by the TPNW. The report looks at states' conduct in 2021 through the lens of each of these prohibitions and also the important positive obligations. And we don't have time to discuss all of them here, but Matt, Stuart, and Bonnie will go through some of them now.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Looks at states' conduct in 2021 through the lens of each of these prohibitions and also the important positive obligation.
Can you hear me?
At states' conduct in
Sorry for this interruption. Matt, now you're welcome to take the floor.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you all for being here in person or online. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So in the interest of global nuclear transparency, the goal that we have at the Federation of American Scientists is to produce the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear arsenals and trends by analyzing information from a really wide variety of open sources. And my colleague Hans Christensen and I were really delighted to be invited to contribute some of our data to this year's edition of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. We're both big believers in promoting nuclear transparency, and so we hope this is going to be a really nice and long-running partnership. So without further ado, we can dive into this data. So as you can see on this slide, 89 parties are compliant with the treaty's prohibition on developing, producing, manufacturing, or otherwise acquiring nuclear weapons. 97 countries are not parties, but are compatible with that particular provision. And then as far as we know, there are 2 states of concern, Iran and Saudi Arabia. 9 states that are not party to the treaty, China, France, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, engaged in conduct in 2021 that could be considered not compatible with that particular provision. And so that image that you can see on that slide is a satellite image of some of China's new missile silos, for example. And during 2021, FAS was one of a few organizations that helped disclose the existence of approximately 300 new missile silos in eastern Xinjiang, which effectively constitutes the largest expansion of China's nuclear arsenal ever. So you kind of get a sense of how things are changing in 2021. Next slide, please. Those same 9 states also engaged in conduct in 2021 that was not compatible with the treaty's prohibition on possessing and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. The modernization campaigns of all 9 nuclear armed states, by which I mean the replacement and general improvement of all nuclear delivery systems and their associated warheads, are largely driven by the global competitive environment that is being embraced by nuclear armed states. And this is, pretty classic, arms race behavior. States improve their own capabilities. Their competitors respond to those improvements by developing systems to offset those advantages, and then states have to in turn match and exceed those new capabilities. And what we're seeing is that many weapon systems currently being developed and produced are set to remain operational well into the 2070s and 2080s, implying that the states in question are committing themselves to nuclear armament for at least half a century into the future, longer than the NPT has actually been in existence. And some of those new systems include things like ballistic missile submarines, for example, like India's Arihant class, which you can see in this picture. The deployment of that system effectively gives India, a sort of a nascent nuclear triad. So it's quite a significant system. Next slide, please. As you can see, at the beginning of 2022, approximately 90% of all nuclear warheads were owned by Russia and the United States, who each have, between 5,000 and 600 estimated nuclear weapons in their total inventories. Russia's stockpile, which is to say its arsenal of kind of more usable nuclear weapons, is approximately 4,477 warheads, and the United States' stockpile is approximately 3,708 warheads. No other nuclear armed state sees a need for more than a few hundred nuclear weapons for its national security, although many of those countries did quantitatively and qualitatively increase their arsenals throughout 2021. Next slide, please. So here are just some kind of key figures here. I already mentioned Russia's and the United States' stockpile numbers, but when you add those numbers together with the 7 other nuclear armed countries, you get a total of approximately 9,440 warheads in these countries' military stockpiles, so some more kind of usable nuclear weapons. Within that stockpile, you have you can break that down by deployed strategic warheads, deployed non-strategic warheads, and strategic and non-strategic warheads in central storage. Additionally, there are approximately 3,265 retired warheads, the majority of which are held by the United States and Russia, that are currently awaiting dismantlement. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a second. Hans and I estimate that the total number of nuclear weapons in the world adds up to approximately 12,705 warheads. That number has been in steady decline on an annual basis, but this is almost entirely because of the United States and Russia dismantling retired warheads. They dismantle, a couple hundred each year, and that is kind of really where the good news ends from a disarmament perspective. Next slide, please. China, India, North Korea, and back one slide, please. There we go, perfect. China, India, North Korea, and Pakistan all increased their total arsenals in 2021. And although Russia's more usable military stockpile appeared stable in 2021, they have been steadily increasing over the past few years as well. The United States' usable stockpile increased slightly in 2019, but then declined over the next couple of years in 2020 and 2021. France's and Israel's stockpiles have remained roughly constant. With regards to the United Kingdom, in its 2021 integrated review, the UK government announced a pretty significant increase in the upper limit of the UK's nuclear inventory, up to approximately 260 warheads. And it's unclear what has prompted the UK to reverse what would otherwise be considered decades of gradual disarmament policy. UK government officials have offered somewhat differing or somewhat vague explanations for the stockpile ceiling increase. But following the publication of the review, the UK Defense Secretary explicitly pointed to improvements in Russia's ballistic missile defense capabilities as one driving factor, with another potential factor allowing the UK's ballistic missile submarines to deploy with a full load of Trident missiles and warheads, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. Regardless of the reason, this kind of sudden decision from the United Kingdom effectively reverses several decades of kind of gradual disarmament-minded policies and couples the UK together with China and Russia as the three members of the P5 to increase the sizes of their nuclear stockpiles in conflict with their obligations under the NPT. Next slide, please. At the beginning of 2022, the collective yield of the nuclear armed states' military stockpiles or usable stockpiles was approximately 2,059.2 megatons, which is the equivalent of roughly 138,000 Hiroshima equivalent bombs, which is quite striking. Combined, the United States and Russia are responsible for approximately 90% of the global nuclear stockpile yield. Both countries operate nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines that can fire several missiles that also carry several warheads on top of each of them, which means that the total firepower on board a single ballistic missile submarine can be quite extraordinary in magnitude. So for example, we estimate that the average loadout of a single Russian Borei-class SSBN equates to approximately 6.4 megatons, which is 427 Hiroshima bomb equivalents. And the average loadout of a single US Ohio-class SSBN equates to approximately 19 megatons, or 1,266 Hiroshima bomb equivalents. So therefore, even within an average loadout, a single Russian SSBN is believed to carry as much destructive power as the entire combined nuclear arsenals of India and Israel, while the destructive power carried on board a single US ballistic missile submarine is believed to be twice that of the entire combined arsenals of India, Pakistan, and Israel. Next slide, please. As you can see in this infographic, submarine-launched nuclear warheads make up the plurality of the world's usable warheads, accounting for roughly 2/5 of the global stockpile. This is largely because nearly every nuclear armed state operates ballistic missile or attack submarines that can launch several nuclear weapons, like I mentioned earlier. Significant numbers of nuclear warheads are also actively deployed during peacetime on mobile and siloed intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as at bomber bases. And several hundred warheads are also assigned to tactical delivery systems or air, coastal, and missile defense systems, although those are mostly kept in central storage. Some states, such as China, India, Pakistan, and Israel, keep the majority or even the entirety of their nuclear stockpiles in storage during peacetime, while others, such as France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, deploy nuclear weapons on alert in peacetime. Next slide, please. So the TPNW does not have any state parties that are also nuclear armed states. They certainly could join if they wanted to, either through unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral measures. However, as of the beginning of 2022, there was no evidence that any of the nuclear armed states had the will or the interest to purposefully pursue nuclear disarmament or to develop plans for its realization. This is despite the fact that all of the nuclear armed states claim publicly to support nuclear disarmament and the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So not only are the global kind of usable military stockpiles of nuclear weapons increasing, as I mentioned earlier, but the number of dismantled warheads each year is shrinking. And you can see this dynamic represented on this graph, right? As the blue line, which is the global stockpile number, as that trickles up, the orange line, which is the global nuclear inventory, including retired warheads, kind of trickles down. And as you can see, around 2007, the pace of reductions, slowed quite dramatically. Eventually, those two lines are going to converge if no action on disarmament is taken. And when that happens, the global inventory of nuclear weapons will begin to increase for the first time since the end of the Cold War. Next slide, please. No matter whether nuclear disarmament is achieved through some combination of unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral mechanisms, nuclear disarmament verification is going to be needed to generate the trust to indicate that declared disarmament related actions have actually been carried out. And while the process for dismantling a nuclear weapon is well understood, including in the public domain, there are a lot of really significant technical challenges in designing and kind of resourcing the tasks that are involved to verify the destruction of an entire country's nuclear weapons program. That being said, it is kind of increasingly clear that nuclear armed states do not really appear to consider nuclear disarmament to be an urgent humanitarian imperative, an environmental imperative, or even really a security imperative. Indeed, most states, I would say, instead seem to consider disarmament as almost a type of chore that is mandated by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and not one that many states are particularly seriously interested in completing in the foreseeable future. And kind of just anecdotally speaking, it's increasingly rare to hear officials from nuclear weapon states express a coherent rationale for pursuing disarmament other than just as the obligation to do so under the NPT. So that sort of speaks to me to a lack of seriousness about disarmament, or perhaps a lack of vision. And moreover, they seem to be increasingly focused on shifting the responsibility for disarmament onto the non-nuclear weapon states by suggesting that they first have to create these security conditions that make nuclear disarmament possible. And so I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll let my colleagues continue. But thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much indeed, Matt. So as Matt said, we don't have a nuclear disarmament verification architecture. What we do have, as you know, is the verification that's done by the IAEA on the basis of two different types of safeguard agreement. The comprehensive safeguards agreement, perhaps a bit poorly named, and the additional protocol to that agreement. Both of these are international treaties. They are binding under international law, and they are negotiated and adopted between the state and the IAEA. The CSA is the basic agreement. It's required by the NPT, and it is basically looking at preventing diversion of material and from nuclear related activities to non-peaceful purposes. Following the discovery that this was not sufficient to ensure that states were not cheating on their non-proliferation obligations, in particular in the situation in Iraq, the additional protocol was developed. And this permits access to other sites at short notice and to other elements of the nuclear cycle, including mining of material. The Tpnw is more advanced than is the NPT in terms of safeguards. So any state that joins the Tpnw at any point must maintain all of its safeguard agreements in force when the Tpnw entered into force, so the 22nd of January. And any state that has not yet concluded, signed, and entered into force a comprehensive safeguards agreement that joins the Tpnw must do so. Currently, we have two states parties that are required to do just that, Palestine and Guinea-Bissau. They have deadlines under the treaty, one in July of this year, another in September of next year, and it is hoped that they will do so well in advance. We focused on the 59 states parties as of the end of last year, but just for the sake of completeness, Côte d'Ivoire, which joined the treaty recently, has both a CSA and an additional protocol and must therefore maintain it. This gives you an idea of the state of adherence to these two agreements in all non-nuclear armed states, because under the NPT, it is only the non-nuclear weapon states that have to undertake, conclude, and enter into force a comprehensive safeguards agreement. There is also a third type of agreement called a small quantities protocol. And there is an original version and a modified version. The original version is problematic. Why? Because not only does it minimize the ability of the IAE to go in and look at the situation in a state, the IAE does not even have the permission, the authority to go in and check that those conditions are still in force. Now, Matt mentioned a little earlier the concern around Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia only has an original small quantities protocol, even though its quantity of material and its plans for a nuclear reactor would exceed that which it's allowed to under the SQP. Indeed, one of the leading non-proliferation experts describes Saudi Arabia as the #1 proliferation risk in the world. So this is an urgent concern. The IAEA are attempting to deal with this, but this is problematic. And indeed, the US has engaged with Saudi Arabia in the past, does not even require that an additional protocol be in place for nuclear cooperation with another, another state. It is a policy, but not a law. Thankfully, of course, despite the events of the last few weeks, we have not seen nuclear weapons used in anger since those two occasions in the latter days of the Second World War. There were both serious proposals and risks, of course, that they would have been used. Successive US governments considered, or military authorities also considered using in 1949, just prior to the Korean War, during the Korean War, and then during the Vietnam War. There was serious consideration given to use of nuclear weapons, but luckily that has not happened. Testing, of course, is not considered use under the Tpnw, but it may amount to threatening to use depending on the circumstances. The prohibition on threatening to use under the Tpnw is not found in the NPT. This is a specific and a broad prohibition. It's broader than the prohibition on the use of the threat of the use of force under the UN Charter. We found, based on our research, that there was no clear-cut case last year where nuclear weapons were threatened to be used. The closest, perhaps, was Operation Global Thunder in November of last year, and this was an announced operation by the US, where they had strategic bombers flying towards Russia, both from the east and the west, and came within 20 kilometers of the Russian border. This was, as I said, an announced operation, but I think it's clear to say that any similar operation under current circumstances would be extremely unwise. More recently, of course, this year, we've seen President Putin threatening consequences never seen before. I think we understand this was an implicit threat to use nuclear weapons. And we also saw a response from the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Le Drian, reminding Russia that NATO was a nuclear alliance. Finland and Sweden, as we know, are considering whether to join NATO, and that would potentially bring them within the nuclear alliance that is NATO today. As Greta said earlier, here is where the largest number of states are acting in a manner that is not compatible with the prohibitions in Article 1 of the Tpnw. The prohibition on assisting, by which is meant material assistance to a prohibited activity, and then encouraging or inducing, which is equivalent to abetting. So it's inciting, but without providing material assistance. NATO, as is stated in its strategic concept, is a nuclear alliance. So if you are a member of NATO, unless you disavow that position, then you are effectively encouraging possession. We also, you may not be able to see it there, but in the list of states, there are some that have a bilateral arrangement with the United States. And then there is the Marshall Islands. They are listed because they allow the US to test nuclear capable missiles on its territory. And that is a material assistance. That does not mean, however, that it is not possible to be party to a multinational alliance and also a state party to the TPNW. It's the conditions under which that alliance operates that are significant. So NATO makes it explicit that it's a nuclear alliance. The CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, does not make it explicit. And indeed, there are non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the TPNW that are legitimately members of that organization. You can see some examples of how nuclear armed states are aided and abetted. As Greta said, beyond the 9 nuclear armed states, we have another 32 that operate in different ways to assist to maintain nuclear weapons in the world today. Here you can see a few of them, whether it be participation in strike exercises or the provision of technology or the provision of parts and components. There is also the specific prohibition on seeking or receiving assistance for prohibited activities. Here, you may not be able to see, but there are 5 listed. So Belarus has, on a number of occasions, both last year and this year, sought to have nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. France is assisted by Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands through the support from the Airbus Group for its nuclear weapons arsenal and activities. Russia gets support for the production of launchers for its mobile ICBMs from Belarus. The UK receives very detailed assistance for its Trident missile system from the United States, and the United States gets support from 5 European states for the stationing of nuclear weapons. And here you can see those 5, so Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey. More recently, so in this year, not in the 2021 period, Belarus reiterated its call for Russian nuclear weapons to be stationed on its territory. And in the last few days, South Korea, the incoming president, has called for US nuclear weapons to be stationed once again on South Korea. And over to Bonnie.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And thank you to my hosts and to NPA. I'm trying to share my screen. Can someone give me power to do that? It's saying who can share.
Yeah, no, the plan was that we will press the button for you here, Bonnie. Is that okay?
I think it's changed. Hold on a second.
Yeah, there's something that happened to the.
We figured that out. Hold on a second.
Okay. Okay. Good.
I think we've got it. Just let me get it on slide view. Hold on one second, everybody. Thank you for your patience. And is that working? Can someone let me know?
Yeah, that's good, Bonnie.
Okay, thank you. So thank you again to my hosts and to NPA and all those who've been involved with the Nuclear Weapon Ban Monitor for all your hard work and for allowing me to participate today. And thanks to all of you, both on Zoom and in person. Sorry, I can't join you in Geneva, but I'm glad to be able to participate virtually. So in addition to the prohibitions and the safeguard obligations that Matt and Stuart discussed, the TPNW also includes several positive obligations that address the harm caused by nuclear weapons use and testing, as well as to promote the universalization of the treaty. This year's Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor explains the need for and the interpretation of these obligations, as well as provides principles and examples of implementation. The obligation to assist victims, which I'll talk about first, Article 6.1, seeks to address the range of human suffering caused by the use and testing of nuclear weapons. It is well known, the types of assistance, the types of suffering that are caused by the use and testing of nuclear weapons. And they cause deaths and horrific injuries, long-term illnesses, socioeconomic exclusion and displacement, to name a few. However, a comprehensive overview of these effects and the needs of affected populations is unavailable to date. We do know that states are more likely to have affected individuals within their jurisdiction in 3 situations. First, their territory was the site of nuclear detonations. So, for example, in the territory of states parties Kazakhstan and Kiribati. Second, they have populations, particularly veterans, that were in the vicinity of nuclear detonations. That has occurred for veterans of New Zealand and Fiji. And third, their territory was downwind of atmospheric nuclear detonation. And these are situations that are more complicated to determine, but would certainly warrant further study, particularly in the states parties in the Pacific. The monitor includes examples of existing programs from states in these different categories, as well as from user states. And I won't elaborate on these here, but while each of these offers lessons learned for victim assistance program, none offers a comprehensive and adequate response. To discuss a little bit about the interpretation of Article 6.1, the obligation places primary responsibility on affected states parties to provide victim assistance, and its non-exhaustive list of assistance includes medical care, rehabilitation, psychological support, as well as measures to ensure socioeconomic inclusion. The assistance must be sensitive to age and gender and be applied without discrimination. The end goal is to ensure that victims can realize their human rights. To make victim assistance more manageable, however, Article 6.1 can be understood to allow affected states to progressively realize some of their obligations, especially those related to the economic, social, and cultural rights. Victims, as the 1MS first meeting of states parties approaches, and it's approaching very quickly, states parties should begin to implement their victim assistance obligations. They can look to international law and national practice for guidance. The Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions are particularly important precedent because the TPNW's Articles 6 and 7, both of which I'll talk about, the other provisions I'll talk about later, draw heavily from them. The TPNW states parties should take a series of practical steps in the near term, including developing a national plan and budget, adopting relevant laws and policies, collecting and disseminating information about the needs, about the contamination and the needs of victims. In addition, states parties should be guided by certain fundamental principles that have been widely accepted in the landmine and cluster munitions context. In particular, transparency, which ensures monitoring, evaluation, and accountability, the accessibility of programs and of information about programs, non-discrimination, and the inclusion of affected individuals, communities, and their representatives. Kazakhstan and Kiribati are currently co-facilitating work on Articles 6 and 7 in the lead up to the first meeting of states parties. And their working paper, which has been prepared after several rounds of consultations, which are ongoing right now, proposes addressing many of these elements in the meeting's outcome documents and in future intercessional work. The paper covers victim assistance, but also environmental remediation and international cooperation assistance, which I'll discuss in a minute. And also I note that as the monitor notes, publications by Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic provides more in-depth discussion of the implementation of all 3 of these obligations. So the second obligation I'll discuss is environmental remediation, which appears in Article 6.2. And this focuses on addressing the environmental damage caused by nuclear weapons. Radioactive fallout has contaminated water, farmland, fisheries, and hunting grounds. As a result, it has damaged the environment and biodiversity, interfered with food security, endangered local residents' health and way of life, and again, caused displacement. Article 6.2 obliges affected states parties to, quote, take necessary and appropriate measures towards the remediation of contaminated areas. In requiring measures towards environmental remediation, it recognizes that in most cases, the environment cannot be returned to its pre-detonation state. So again, it's a long-term obligation and mandates that steps be taken to clean affected areas and further reduce further exposure. But unlike earlier treaties, does not set a specific deadline for completion. The band monitor describes national remediation policies and practices from both states parties and states not party, and they represent positive steps, but have led to mixed results. Beginning the process of implementing environmental remediation obligation requires many of the same practical steps as victim assistance. So at the first meeting of states parties, Tpnw, states parties should commit to establishing, again, many of these same steps towards establishing an infrastructure for implementation. Again, developing a national plan and budget, appointing a government focal point, adopting relevant laws and policies, collecting and disseminating information about the threats of contamination. They should also start conducting an initial assessment of the situation and collect and disseminate information. Once the remediation begins, it should be understood to encompass measures to address the contamination itself, such as through containment, removal, or treatment of the material. It also should break the pathways of human exposure, such as by marking and fencing or putting warning signs up, as well as conducting risk reduction education. Throughout the process, remediation measures should follow a precautionary and iterative approach. The third obligation of this package is Article 7 on international cooperation and assistance. Article 6 must be read in conjunction with Article 7 because together they create a framework of shared responsibility for victim assistance and environmental remediation. It's an essential part of the Tpnw because it shows that affected states do not bear the burden of these obligations alone. Article 7 requires all states parties to cooperate to facilitate implementation of the treaty, and it obliges all states parties in a position to do so to provide assistance to help the affected states parties implement their obligations. Donor states can provide a range of assistance. For example, it can be technical support in the form of medical, scientific, or environmental expertise. It can provide material support, such as healthcare or remediation equipment. And of course, there's financial support to support affected states parties programs. As a result of this variety, almost all states parties should be positioned to provide some assistance in some way. Article 7.6 also explicitly obligates user and testing states to provide adequate assistance for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And it's also important to note that the states not party can contribute to this process as well. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions show the effectiveness of the obligation. And in 2020, donor states under those conventions provided $565 million in mine action. That said, a global needs survey would help prioritize donor resources for the most affected areas and populations. And I just want to conclude by emphasizing Article 12 of the convention, which requires states parties to, quote, encourage not states parties to sign or ratify the treaty. The treaty does not specify how states parties can encourage universalization, so it gives them the flexibility to choose the most effective method. Overall, the implementation in 2021 was very impressive, and this slide lists a number of ways in which states upheld this obligation. I won't run through them all, but a couple examples: 70 states, parties, signatories, and others endorsed the UNGA's 2020 resolution calling for states parties to join the Tpnw. And several states, including Malta, New Zealand, and the Cook Islands, for example, held celebrations honoring the Tpnw's entry into force in January 2021. And you can see in the slide a picture of the castle in Malta celebrating that occasion. So at this point, I think I'll turn it back, I think, to Greta or Stuart, because I think we want to leave some time for questions. So I'll stop my slide sharing and pass it back to the floor. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's for Jamie, sorry. I have.
Thanks very much. I think that's working. I think I managed to make real life microphones work better than my virtual microphones. But many thanks to our hosts. Many thanks, Greta and Stuart, for the invitation. to participate and speak today at the launch of the monitor. It's very much appreciated. Ireland is very, very pleased indeed to be a supporter, indeed a supporter from I think the very beginning of this incredibly important publication. And we're in extremely good company as well, of course, with our very good friends from Austria and New Zealand and Plowshares in supporting the monitor as well. And I really do want to first and foremost thank all of those who worked on this production. Before I joined Ireland's Foreign Service, I worked on a very similar publication as a researcher, and I can well remember the blood, sweat and tears that go into a production like this. So I just wanted to say that it is indeed very much appreciated. I'm in a much more comfortable position now, I think, as a state representative, but I can't stress enough how helpful a document like this is as a resource for the treaty and for states parties and for everybody working on implementation of the TPNW. I think that the presentations that we've heard today, and thank you to all of the panelists for your presentations, they really demonstrate that the monitor is about much more than just data. It's about much more than just raw data. It's the expert analysis and interpretation of that data, which is then applied to situate the TPNW in the broader architecture of the disarmament and non-proliferation regime that's really and truly valuable. And it's this kind of resource that becomes all the more important as we approach the first meeting of states parties for the TPNW, which, as Bonnie mentioned, is approaching very, very quickly and making us all focus our minds on making that a big success. And indeed, as the monitor itself rightly points out, the MSP is going to be a milestone in terms of the global community's efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. And in that respect, preparations are indeed very far advanced. Thanks in no small part, of course, to the expert guidance of our Austrian chair, Alexander Kment, and his team. They've done really and truly a superb job in preparing us as states parties for the first meeting of states parties in a really inclusive and very energetic way. And that's despite some seriously significant obstacles in terms of the shifting public health situation and a very crowded disarmament calendar as well. As many people know, the MSP, of course, is going to take some very important decisions on the functioning of the treaty, how it's going to be operationalized and institutionalized, and it'll also take important decisions in relation to codifying elimination deadlines and framing future work on issues, as we just heard from Bonnie, on issues like victim assistance and environmental remediation as well. It's also an incredibly important moment for embedding further the norms at the core of the treaty, furthering the principle of the complete prohibition of nuclear weapons without any conditionality, and really underpinning the humanitarian approach to nuclear disarmament, which is very much at the heart of the TPNW. The ban monitor itself is going to be an extremely valuable and indeed an essential resource, I think, in that effort. By evaluating, and I stress evaluating, as I said, rather than just presenting raw data, the extent to which the policies and practices of all states comply with the core obligations in the TPNW, it demonstrates where and what needs to be done and by whom. And that's not just for states outside of the TPNW, it's for states inside, states parties too. It's very encouraging, for example, to see at a glance the rate and fulfillment of the Article 2 reporting obligations, for example, very, very useful. And the monitor is also a significant tool for our universalization efforts as well, our obligation to promote the universalization of the treaty. As this year's report highlights, it's extremely encouraging to know that the vast majority of states are in compliance with underlying principles of the TPNW, and just a small minority of states explicitly base their security on the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons. And we've also seen some very positive signals on participation at the MSP as well by NATO states, which we hope is a signal that some of the rather unfounded hysteria around the treaty is starting to dissipate. It's also clear, however, that we have some really significant challenges ahead of us as well. The Tpnw, of course, doesn't operate at all in a vacuum. Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine, for example, has seen a number of extremely troubling developments, including the implicit threat of use of nuclear weapons, as Stuart mentioned, an increase in the alert levels of Russia, an accusation against Ukraine that it is developing nuclear weapons, and Belarus's announcement that it would be willing to host nuclear weapons on its territory, indeed altering its constitution. The Tpnw needs to demonstrate that it can be responsive and relevant against the backdrop of a resurgent nuclear rhetoric in many respects. And we've also seen, I think, as Greta has mentioned, the pace of signature and ratifications decrease. And much of this, I'm sure, is related to the pandemic and the situation that we've been, that we found ourselves in over the past 2 years. But we mustn't be complacent in terms of our universalization efforts. And as I said, I think this publication really serves us in that regard and gives us the tools necessary to approach these challenges in a really meaningful way and indeed head on. I think I've probably already gone over my 2 minutes that Greta very generously gave me. So I just wanted to end by saying I do look forward to continuing to work on all of these issues and to a long history for the ban monitor going forward as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jamie. As you realize, we are already over time, but I think because we started slightly late, we might just take one question from the room and perhaps one question from online participants. So, but before we do so, let me just recall, according to the EU General Data Protection Regulation, that this is a public session, so it may be subject to recording, transfer, and posting on social media. Therefore, if you do not wish your name or position to appear, you may refrain from introducing yourself when asking your question. That being said, is there any question in the room? No. Do we have a question online from online participants?
Yes, we have some questions. The first one on how to find the missing link. On the one hand, peaceful people dream of an arm-free world. On the other hand, nuclear weapons, at least when at the hands of democratic states, seem more than ever the best guarantee by default of world peace. As exemplified by recent protests for supports of Ukraine, where pacifists and socialites had no proposal except for slogan and solidarity, than a repeat of their disarmament banners. Is one possible missing link mobilization of worldwide public opinion feasible these days to impress upon the big bad wolves and force the naughty to give up?
Yes, mobilization of the people, how to get people into the streets, because, well, public opinion polls show that people do care a lot about this issue, but how to get them to voice their concerns and put pressure on their politicians is the difficult. Well, that is what is challenging. We have a very difficult situation now with Ukraine and the nuclear blackmail that Putin has been exerting, which is a situation where we can go both ways. It can get worse, but it can also be an opportunity. If the response to the situation in Ukraine is more reliance on nuclear deterrence, that is a call for further proliferation. And it is a call for a continuation of a system that allows exactly the kind of nuclear blackmail that Putin has been exerting. So I'm hopeful that that this will be clear, and that politicians in umbrella states and beyond see that now they have to now demand nuclear disarmament, that they need to stop considering nuclear weapons both as something unacceptable and as something desirable, that they need to be more proactive on nuclear disarmament. And I believe that the first meeting of states parties will be a good opportunity for that rationale and the voice of concern of people on this issue to be to come to the fore. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really, really great presentation, super interesting. I wonder, Stuart, if you can explain a little bit more on the sort of thinking around how to define a threat to use of nuclear weapons. And I'm thinking particularly seeing the developments this last few months, particularly Putin's comments as he launched the invasion, saying that if anyone interferes or intervenes, there will be consequences that you've never seen before. But then also, of course, a couple of days later, the decision to increase the alert levels of nuclear weapons. And then some other statements by I think Minister of Foreign, was it Lavrov or someone else, Defense Minister maybe, who is sort of no options are off the table, or things like that. Like, how do you define what a threat is in terms of this treaty? And if you can kind of just talk us through a little bit about where the line is there.
Sure. Well, I mean, the line will be drawn by states, not by us. What we've done in the monitor is to take a conservative view and a restrictive view. When the International Court of Justice looked at the threat or use of nuclear weapons, they kind of dodged the issue of what a threat of nuclear weapons was, of course, long prior to the wording in the Tpnw. And there's a rather cryptic statement in the advisory opinion where they say, of course, the possession of nuclear weapons implies that they may be used. We clearly do not think that that's far too broad. There are others that disagree, that say that the mere fact of deterrence is threatening to use. But we felt that based on the discussions in the diplomatic conference, that we should define it narrowly as something that is specific, targeted, and credible. So that means if a Minister of Agriculture says, oh, we should use nuclear weapons, we're not going to consider that. It has to be somebody at the very senior levels, just as it is under international criminal law for aggression. It also has to be specific, targeted against a particular enemy, because otherwise you end up back with deterrence as, of course, anyone that attacks us using nuclear weapons, we will respond. So what we've done is to look at a number of instances, whether it be missile tests, whether it be nuclear strike exercises, in the context at the time. Very important, one act at one time may be a threat, and at another time it may not be. But at the same time, a threat does not have to be explicit. And you gave a very good example of Putin this year, that although our focus was on 2021, it is clear from the context exactly what he was implying, as you mentioned, Jamie. And when we report on that for next year's report, we will again make it very clear that that was a threat to use nuclear weapons and would not be compatible with the prohibition in the Tpnw. So, as I said, others may take different views. It may be that in the first meeting of states parties, the declaration will talk about this issue in some form and give us further guidance. But for the moment, we think narrow and focused is the way to go.
a few garbled questions. Kazmira Jefford from Geneva Solutions, media based here in Geneva. I know this report, we're looking specifically at 2021, but given that what's happened so far this year is extremely important, can you give any indication to what your findings will look like for this current year? Is it going to be dramatically different to the trajectory that you've painted for 2021? And if you could talk a little bit to that.
Thanks very much. Well, I've mentioned one instance, the threatening to use, where I think we were clear in this report, even though we were focusing on 2021, that what Putin said was a threat to use nuclear weapons. So that would be one finding. We're only in April. Clearly, we've seen some horrific scenes over the last 2 months, but it really does depend, as Greta said, on which way we go. And if we look back in history, at the darkest times with respect to nuclear weapons, we saw progress. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we saw the Partial Test Ban Treaty, a major step forward. In the aftermath of Operation Able Archer and the Petrov incident in '83, we saw the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which sadly no longer exists. These were, in the darkest times, these were steps forward because we had statesmen. The question is, do we have statesmen today? And that we will find out in the months that come.
Maybe just a last short question.
Yes, thank you so much for the report. We would certainly use that as a tool also by state parties. I just have one question. I could see from the presentation of Bonnie all the information regard to the obligation of victim assistance and environmental remediation. I would like to know if also the report covers if the extent of damage to the environment and the extension of victims that exist now, or if there is, from the information of states in the future, it would be added to the report. Thank you so much.
The report provides available and the information that is available on consequences for people and for the environment, and tries to we work very hard to find information on what are the ongoing needs for victim assistance and environmental remediation. The fact is that we don't have a comprehensive overview of this, which after having looked at this now for 2 or 3 years, it is really shocking that after decades of nuclear weapons testing, that we don't have a global overview of the needs for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And it is partly due to well, the fact that nuclear-armed states, the states that have done the testing, that they are not keen on the topic to be discussed. And the Tpnw will be a tool for the first and affected states parties like Kiribati and Kazakhstan to assess their own needs, prioritize, bring them forth during the meeting of states parties, and hopefully that way we can expand. So that it will inspire other states as well to do the same, in order to be able to achieve or to get assistance. One thing on national implementation measures that we haven't discussed here today is that Algeria, who is only a signatory, they have done something very important, which the Tpnw obliges them to do, which is to have national implementation measures, and they have established a national agency for environmental remediation, which has as its mandate to seek international support to do environmental remediation. So we can see how the treaty is well, it's making it's an implementation mechanism that makes this happen. So every state that believes that they have needs, ongoing needs, need to do their own national assessments. But a key, it's a sort of a very, I keep coming back to this continuously, and we are working to get funding for this. We should also have a global needs assessment. We should get all of this information out in one collective piece, and we are trying to do that as a part of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor to put together a global needs assessment. But it has to happen together with the affected populations, of course. Yes.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we'll have to stop here. We could, of course, continue speaking about these fascinating issues. Thank you very much to the speakers, to the experts who put together the monitor, and to the people who came to join us online. And just hope that your work and our collective work will help us survive until the next edition of the monitor next year. So let's look forward to that. And again, thank you very much, and hope to have a chance to see you again in person or online on a future opportunity. Thank you so much.